first of those two is looking at Africa, and then the second we're going to be looking at the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. And I've given this study or lesson the title is Situation in Africa, subtitle Difficult but Not Hopeless. So as we go through this lesson, I think you're going to find some of the material will seem quite somber, but then towards the end of the lesson, we're going to switch and try and show, yeah, maybe difficult, but there are ways to work even through those difficulties. Also, just as a way of kind of preamble, well, so what's going to happen is I will probably do a presentation for about half an hour, then we can have about 10 minutes, hopefully, if I get through it in time, to chat about what I've been presenting. No, let's backtrack. We'll have half an hour, then I'll show this thing that's the hopeful signs, then we'll have a chat, and then we'll have Mark. So that's the general plan. And just why Africa? So probably at least 15 years ago, I started to take an interest in what's happening in the world, climate change, global warming, and so on. And I took the view then that Africa was probably going to be the continent that would be hardest hit for a variety of reasons. As I've prepared the lesson for today, I've seen that there are plenty of others who share that opinion. For example, I found an article about climate change on the BBC, and it just said the African continent will be hardest hit by climate change. And the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN body, takes very much the same view. Africa as a whole is one of the most vulnerable continents due to its high exposure and low adaptive capacity. So, I mean, if that's the case, that Africa is particularly susceptible to climate change and particularly going to struggle because it's a poor continent, then that makes a very strong case for giving it some particular attention. So I'm going to run through some of what's likely to be happening in Africa in a climate perspective, and then what are some of the practical consequences of that. So we started looking at how global warming is affecting the climate on a worldwide basis in the last lesson, but now we're going to focus in on Africa. And I'm just going to show you a number of graphics, which I think should be fairly, not too complicated to understand. So we've got temperature rises. This is similar to the one that we looked at last time, except that we're focused on Africa. This is showing the RCP. I can't remember what RCP is. There's something pathway, but the 8.5 is the highest scenario of the greatest degree of global warming that the Ipcc is looking at. So that's the worst of the scenarios that they envisage. So last time we said, okay, global warming on the land masses is probably about 50% higher than global warming overall. In the center of land masses, it may be even higher. And there's some reasons which seem to me rather complicated, that they think that warming in Africa may be even higher still due to the way that air currents and things like that might change. So we're expecting quite substantial rises in temperature in Africa. Okay, if we get that high case scenario, which is currently the trajectory we're on. If we then go on to rainfall, this is the Ipcc's projection of rainfall. Hi, Mark. So the Ipcc, their forecasts, they say that they're fairly confident about what's going to happen with temperature, but they're not as confident when it comes to rainfall. And they have a lot of kind of caveats, and they say, you know, amongst other things, there's less good data for Africa than there is for some other continents. They say that rainfall is very, very sensitive to changes in ocean currents, and this and that. It's just really complicated, I think, for them. But nonetheless, they've come out with this. And the kind of big picture is that they expect, well, as you can see, over in kind of the Horn of Africa and East Africa, a lot more rain, and then Northwest Africa, and to quite a large extent, Southern Africa, they're expecting to get quite a lot less rain. And this is going to be significant as we continue. Do stop me if anything isn't clear, but hopefully it's fairly straightforward so far. So we've obviously got rainfall affects humidity. I don't think we need to spend a lot of that. It's a similar kind of situation where there's less rainfall. Not surprisingly, there's lower humidity. So these are the figures of what they're expecting, substantially lower humidity than before. And yeah, particularly in Northwest and Southern Africa. And these dots and stipples, as they call them, are supposed to indicate how confident they are about those projections. Which way around they go, I'm not sure. All right, so then sort of combining that, we've got, obviously, if you've got concerned about cultivating plants and crops, then you need soil moisture. And soil moisture will clearly depend on something like the combination of rainfall and evaporation. If you get more rainfall, it'll get wetter. If you get more evaporation, it'll get drier. So I don't think that's too complicated. And you can see on the left-hand map of Africa that you've got a whole lot of drying in Southern Africa, they're expecting. And to some extent, up in the kind of French-speaking parts of Africa in the Northwest. But it makes sense to me that if you get drying in an area where there's already very high rainfall, it's not going to give you too much difficulty. But if you get drying in areas where there's currently not very much rainfall, then you're going to have a lot of difficulty. So if you look at the right-hand map, that shows the typical rainfall. And so you can see that all across Southern Africa, so Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, and some of the other neighboring countries, which don't get a lot of rainfall, they're going to get even drier. The same thing applies to the kind of the Sahel, the band that runs along the south of the Sahara Desert. So there are definitely some areas there that will become drier. And right up at the top of Africa, sort of on the north, and so Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, those are going to get a lot drier as well. So we can expect those parts of Africa to really struggle. As far as East Africa is concerned, there's a lot of, there are conflicting views in the literature about what's going to happen. And some people argue that it's going to get wetter, and some people argue it's going to get drier. And I think the Ipcc report, they acknowledge that there's a fair degree of uncertainty, what's going on in the Horn of Africa, which has, in probably in our lifetimes, that's been where there has been a lot of drought and a lot of famine. But on these models, it's going to get wetter, if they're correct. Everyone okay so far?
Yes.
All right, then I'm going to press on. Okay, so just so the countries that I listed in that previous slide, about 9 or so countries, this is just picking up on how much, what their populations are and what their GDP is, and GDP per capita. So the significance of that is that if you're thinking about their kind of resilience and their ability to cope with kind of problems that may arise as a result of climate change, or, in the last resort, their ability to buy food from other countries, clearly there are a number of countries here that have very low GDP per capita. For comparison, put in dollar terms, the UK's average GDP per capita is about 47,000. United States is about 68,000. So even the sort of slightly wealthier of these countries is way below the level of sort of the Western nations. So that's some of the sort of big picture of what's happening in terms of temperature, rainfall, humidity, and so on. I'm just going to pick up on a few other things that the climate scientists tell us. So not surprisingly, I'm sure it won't be surprised to you that they say that there are going to be more extreme events. We've got more, more kind of tropical cyclones, and those will be stronger, particularly things that are coming from the Indian Ocean, making landfall over East Africa. So we can expect sort of serious and damaging cyclones, as there have been in recent years. They also expect, well, as we saw in one of those previous slides, you've got like a great deal more precipitation in some areas, and so there's the expectation of floods. And we'll see some examples of that as we go on. So, and also monsoons. So if we go across to looking at West Africa is very much influenced by monsoons. They tend to get, I didn't know this before, but reading around it, you know, places like sort of Cameroon and Niger and so on, very much dependent on monsoon rainfall. But there was a lot of discussion about how that's going to change. Maybe the timing of the monsoon will change, and the intensity of the monsoon will change, and so on. Yeah. So that's enough. And then another change, which we touched on in the previous lesson, is that we're going to see sea level rising. And this is just an example. This is the city of Beira in Mozambique, in sort of Southeast Africa, which is, the city itself is at very, very low lying, not much more than, is hardly above sea level. So as sea level rises, then so cities like this are going to be very much affected. So this is a city of about 500,000 people. Yeah. So those are things that the climate scientists tell us we should expect to happen. I'm going to just go on and talk a little bit about what evidence there is already of these things happening. And there's quite a bit of evidence already. So, for example, they're expecting more rainfall in that kind of East Africa, Horn of Africa area. And here you are, floods in Khartoum, which I guess in Sudan, I guess most of us think of Sudan as an extremely dry place where you wouldn't expect such things to happen. But back in 2020, there were floods affecting, I don't know, so 80 or 90% of South Sudan. This is a little graphic on the BBC, the number of East Africans affected by flooding, very much sort of supporting that idea that rainfall is expected to increase in East Africa. And I'm not going to show it because it's kind of complicated, but I found sort of rainfall charts for those kind of areas of Northwest Africa, and they do clearly show a trend of increasing rainfall over the last 100 years, something like that, particularly so Northwest Africa, places like Algeria, Morocco, the Sahel. Yeah, so the predictions that the climate scientists are making is generally supported by what we can see has been happening. It's not so evident. I'm not sure how evident it is for Southern Africa. Yeah. So we looked at what they're predicting, and we can see that there's evidence that it's already happening, which, you know, supports gives us more confidence that they may well be giving us good predictions. But what are the consequences of all of this? Should we be worried, for example, on account of floods or drought or extreme weather events? I'm going to just, I could open it up, but I'm going to just press on, and then hopefully that'll give us some time for a sort of more general chat afterwards. So I've got this very complicated looking diagram here. And what I've I picked up these figures from Wikipedia, where it's got lists of the kind of world's most devastating famines, most devastating wars, most devastating epidemics, most devastating floods. And I sort of grouped them into 10-year bands and then plotted them, but only things that had where there were more than 1 million deaths. And so you've got here, you can see, for example, in the 1940 band, you've got a yellow column, which is for the World War II. You know, with all said and done, 100 million people perished in different theaters, if you include the sort of Far East and everywhere. So the world's most damaging war. And then you've got 1920s epidemic Spanish flu following World War I, claiming a huge number of lives all around the world. Over on the right-hand side, you've got COVID. There were various things that I didn't know about yet. Okay, so HIV AIDS, I've just plotted it sort of in the middle of when it's happened, so starting in the 1980s, running all the way through to the present, but so far having claimed about 35 million lives. And then you can see these orange columns. And then if we look back over 200 years, there have been a significant number of very, very devastating famines. So going back 1830, 1860, famines, the first one claiming 40 million people, then 60 million people. The 1960s, what they call the Great Chinese Famine, where they're suggesting close to 50 million people possibly died in that. And all through this period, there have been regular, very, very damaging famines. So when you actually add up what events have claimed the most lives, you find that famine has claimed more lives than war, just marginally. Hi, Colin. Yeah, so looking at that kind of information, it makes me think that if we just use kind of, I suppose, the laws of probability, given that famines have been so damaging over the last 200 years and further back if we want to talk about it, plus war. I mean, war is maybe a potential sort of indirect effect of climate change, but famine certainly is. Then it leads me to think that the great risk from climate change in Africa is of famine. And that's also, you know, in my mind, supported by the succession of famines that we have been aware of in Africa, probably in our lifetimes. So that's the kind of direction that my mind is going, to say, you know, famine is that, or famine as a result of drought primarily, is the great risk that that Africa faces. And yeah, going back over that period, there have been some sort of huge numbers of people have perished as a result of famine. So if I'm now going to sort of focus in on that particular aspect and try and look at what risk we might expect. So this looks terrifying, this diagram, but I'm going to try and hopefully unravel it. So it's if climate change is going to result in famine, most likely it's going to be because areas of Africa become drier and are no longer able to sustain agriculture. So the Ipcc report has quite a lot to say on the subject. Just if you just listen to me for a moment, and then I'll try and take you through what this horribly complicated looking diagram means. So the Ipcc has a whole section on the likely impacts in Africa, and there are lots and lots of variables. You know, it depends on which crop you're talking about, which part of Africa you're talking about, which scenario you're referring to, you know, how long into the future you're looking, and so on. And depending on which crop and which variable, they would suggest different levels of reduction in yield from particular crops. So most of the time they think that yields are going to go down because of the damaging effect of climate change. So this particular diagram, once I got my head around it, I thought it was quite useful. So if you look over on the right-hand side, you can see that it's got at the heading mean crop yield change, and then it's got different shades of grey, and the darkest grey means the greatest loss in yield. Then you can see it says 2031 to 2050, so that's forecast going out, I don't know, 10 to 30 years from now, and then 2071 to 2090, so further into the future. So it's got, then it says AR4, AR5. So AR means assessment report. So that was the previous piece of work that the Ipcc did, and AR5 is the latest piece of work, which came out in 2013 and 2014. So if, for example, we wanted to see what was going to happen, what their forecast was for the 2071 to 2090 period for the latest evaluation, that would be the yellow triangle for AR5, Assessment Report 5. And this is just for two crops, sorghum and millet, and it's just for West Africa. So in the previous slides, I was saying it's quite conceivable that in West Africa, we could have temperature rises of 3 to 5 degrees. And also, if you remember, when we stopped on that slide for precipitation, we were expecting precipitation in West Africa to decline quite sharply. Yeah? So what we're in the bottom right hand of this graphic, and you can see that in that area, the yellow triangles, they're sort of occupying areas that suggest, you know, perhaps at a minimum about 20%, or perhaps in some cases 10 up to even 40% loss in yield. So that's and the reason why there are so many of these triangles is that they've got different models that they've been using, and I think they've just plotted a lot of them to give you a sense of the kind of range of results that they've been getting from different models and different scenarios. So the broad picture that these scientists are giving us is that, especially in those areas where there's going to be increased temperature, reduced precipitation, then there's going to be a loss in agricultural output, a loss in yield. And the only way that that could be compensated for is if they then expand the area of land that they're farming. So we've got a loss of yield that's happening and is expected to happen. Pretty much every little mark on that diagram is indicating a loss, a reduction in yield. That's their consistent message, and that's what they show on that chart. That's what they put in writing. In writing, they say estimated yield losses at mid-century range from 18% for Southern Africa to 22% aggregated across sub-Saharan Africa, with yield losses for South Africa and Zimbabwe in excess of 30%. So they are looking at significant loss in agricultural productivity. So this is what climate change is expected to do for the agricultural sector, which is so important in Africa. So I'm going to continue. At the same time, if we take a look at the population of Africa, Africa is pretty much unique in the world as having still a very rapidly rising population. It's slowed compared to what it was, but it's still rising rapidly. So this is 2019 United Nations data. You can see the kind of solid red line showing that kind of central prediction, and then some other sort of dashed and dotted lines showing some ranges that they're predicting. But if we just take their main prediction, you can see that sort of 60 years from where we are, they're expecting Africa to have a population of about 3.2 billion people, compared to about 1.1 billion people now. So 60 years from now, the logic of it is that Africa would need 3 times as much food as it does at present. And that is against the background of agricultural yield going down by 20 to 30% in some areas. So that doesn't look terribly promising. Some people think that yield or agricultural yield in Africa can be improved. It's currently very low compared to many other countries of the world. So there's a very well-known consulting company called McKinsey, which did a study in 2019, and they came up saying, yeah, agricultural yield can be increased substantially from where it's at. Maybe it can. So I hope they're right. But just looking at these figures, it looks pretty difficult. And just to sort of go back to what we've been talking about, Africa is poor, and that creates all sorts of problems of its own. So there's a guy called Amartya Sen, who I think he got a Nobel Prize. I think he's Indian origin, but he did a lot of studies on the subject of famine. And he did a study, I think it was in what was called Bombay at the time, of a huge famine that happened there. But one of the things he said is people have to go hungry if they do not have the means to buy enough food. Hunger is primarily a problem of general poverty. And what he found in Bombay was that there was plenty of food around, but people still starved because they were food prices went up and only the wealthy could afford to buy the food. So although there was enough food, poor people couldn't afford to buy it. But when we think about many parts of Africa, they are poor and they would struggle to be able to afford food if shortages appeared. Probably sort of too long ago for us to remember very clearly, but there was a time around about 2009 when there were shortages of food in the world and prices of staples went up significantly. And that's the kind of thing that we would expect to happen as food becomes scarcer. So that is a further complicating factor. Another kind of complicating factor is the presence of conflict. Conflicts make the situation far worse. Often where there are conflicts, one or other side will actually block supplies of food, which they think it can be to their sort of strategic interests to do that. When there are conflicts, people flee from the lands that they're on, and then they need to be supported by other people because they don't have any source of food. So conflicts are a huge significant factor, and there have been plenty of conflicts in Africa over the years. So that's another thing that seriously complicates the situation for Africa. So that is mostly my little presentation on the negative and the difficulties. As I said, I'm going to follow it by a little presentation, which I think will be much more positive, which will take about 10 minutes. I'm going to show you 2 quick videos. But before we do that, I'd just like to get your reactions to things that I've been presenting there.
Can you hear me, Simon?
Yep.
It's perhaps confirming again what we know is that the poorer parts of the world are the ones that are going to suffer the greatest.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think that's why we need to have a particular kind of heart for Africa, because it is so much poorer than every other continent in the world.
Yeah.
I noticed on your chart that the number of people that are dying from famine has shrunk over the years that you showed your chart.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's much less now than it was.
Yeah. So we kind of, you know, we've been in a period of great plenty. In the notes, I'm going to, well, I've got a little newspaper article. It was an excerpt from a book, and the guy who wrote that is commenting that until about 2010, everyone just assumed that this kind of hunger problem or the famine problem had been resolved. And it was the shortages of food and commodities that were experienced in 2010 were quite a sort of wake-up call, quite a surprise to people to discover that there could still be shortages. But I think the kind of the agricultural industry and the use of fertilizers has made a huge difference in yields and supply of food.
Yeah. Some of the famines that you recorded were not due to those things at all. They were due to political ideology.
Yes, absolutely. Totally.
I mean, mainly in China.
Yep. No, I don't dispute that. That's absolutely correct. But it is mismanagement that caused famines in many ways. Yeah. All right. Well, look, if you've got further comments later on that come to you, fine. I'm going to go on and show you these two little short videos, which I think they're kind of fun and interesting, and a bit more positive, which I'm sure you all would like me to be. So, back in 2013, I had a short period of time when I worked for World Vision, which I guess many of you have heard of. And while I was with them, I came across a lady who was looking after their sort of climate change aspects of what they did. And she sent me a link to a video by an Australian called Tony Rinaldo, which I was very impressed with in 2013. And I'm going to show you that one first. This is him now. He's been given a prize, which I'm told is the kind of environmental equivalent of the Nobel Prize. But anyway, let's go on, see how this works out. I'm gonna just stop sharing, come back onto sharing it with it set for the video setting. So I think it'll work better. Just give me a moment. Okay, hopefully this will be better.
World Vision works in 100 countries, and in many of them, certainly in the regions that I've visited, up to 50 or 60% of the landmass might be degraded. And so this natural resource that we expect to make our living off, grow our food off, is either hard pan or deeply gullied or unusable in some way. And to me, that's a very, very serious issue. When you add to that the prospect of climate change, where temperatures are going to be rising, weather patterns are going to be more variable, it's going to be harder and harder to grow crops on the same area of land. And then add to that again, rising populations. So I find it very scary. And last year, an agricultural advisor, international agricultural advisor, Roland Bunch, made very dire predictions for areas of Africa, and he called it the perfect storm, where you've got growing populations, you've got the cessation of the practice of fallowing, because there's simply too many people, they can't rotate their land anymore, and people can't afford artificial fertilizers at the same time that they no longer have livestock to produce manure. And he gives many of the lowland regions of Africa just 10 to 15 years before there's a mighty famine as a consequence of that.
Okay, so that was 2013 that I watched Tony Ronaldo, and he was fairly gloomy at that time. But then I thought to myself, well, as I was preparing for this lesson, I'll see what he's up to today, and found that he's become quite a celebrity. There was an article about him in The Guardian, and he's got this prize. So what has he been doing? And this video is just a touch longer than the previous one. But I think hopefully you'll find it interesting.
Climate change is hurting us all, but it's the world's poorest who are paying the highest price.
Every country in the world is now facing a problem with climate change.
The droughts is making our life difficult. We come to school without eating food.
It's so serious. There is no water.
Right now, COVID, conflict, and climate change have pushed 7 million people in East Africa to the brink of starvation. What can we do about it? Tony Ronaldo is the Senior Climate Action Advisor for World Vision in Australia.
I speak to a lot of communities and farmers, so the people closest to the land and those most in tune with the impacts of climate change. And what they're telling me is that the rainfall has become more unpredictable. And so for them, it's hard to know when to plant, and in many cases, even what to plant, because their seasons have changed so much. They're telling me that weather events have become more extreme. So droughts are harsher and longer lasting. Rainfall events are heavier, leading to more flooding than normal, and in some cases, landslides. And temperatures are higher. It's universal. Almost everywhere I go, people comment on this. Those things have knock-on effects. So what we're seeing is a tendency for more conflict over scarce resources, a tendency for greater migration. People have nothing left at home. Children are more likely to miss out on school, more likely to have poorer nutrition, and there'll be less money for medical needs. And the predictions are, the trends are, it will only get worse. All of the good work that we've done over decades stands to be lost. It will unravel if we do not address this issue. I feel very strongly about this.
You're known as the forest maker, but the technical term is farmer managed natural regeneration, or FMNR. What is it? How does it work? Why is it innovative?
It's innovative, I think, in its simplicity, and it's had an enormous impact, way above and beyond my expectations when I initially developed this approach. When you cut down a tree, it's not the end of the tree's life. The stump remains alive and it has the capacity to resprout. And so farmer managed natural regeneration is simply the selection of the stumps that you want to keep and the management of that regrowth so that you optimize growth. It's really, really simple. And in Niger Republic, where I lived, over a 20-year period, it spread to some 5 million hectares. Within just a few years, this concept of farmers having within their means the ability to restore the vegetation, restore the fertility and productivity of their land quickly and at scale and at low cost, it was a revolution. And without planting a single tree, simply by recognizing what was there, literally at our feet, caring for it, nurturing it, allowing it to regrow, 200 million trees came back into that landscape. The impact of those 200 million trees, without ongoing subsidy or government intervention or World Vision continued action to support it, every year farmers are harvesting an additional 500,000 tons of grain, simply because of the improved soil conditions and microclimate. Their gross income, the value of what they consume and the surplus that they sell, is worth in the order of $900 million every year in the poorest country in the world.
The work that you started in Niger, I think in the early 80s, has now expanded to more than 24 African countries, I understand, including in Ethiopia, where actually it's part of some child sponsorship programs with World Vision funded by Canadians, that FMNR is part of that response. What do you think is the potential as we invest even more in FMNR to alleviate food insecurity, to help build resilience to climate change and other environmental shocks? How can we take this even to a larger scale?
Humbo in the southern portion of Ethiopia, World Vision entered there in 1984 with the big drought and now infamous famine that followed the drought. And we did a wonderful job. We saved many thousands of lives. For the next 20 years, to one degree or another, we were obliged to give some food aid in that community. The Humbo community managed reforestation project was commenced in 2006. 6 years later, this historically food aid dependent community sold 106 tons of grain to the World Food Programme. The World Resources Institute estimates that at the very least there's about 2 billion hectares of degraded land that need restoring. 2 billion hectares. What's the potential? Give me the world. World Vision works in 100 countries. All of them, to one degree or another, are impacted by deforestation.
Right now in places like, let's say, East Africa, which is facing a real hunger crisis at the moment, we're seeing what we might think of as a crisis of 3 C's: climate change, COVID-19, and conflict. How does FMNR fit into a broader response to those other crises?
To make the best of a very bad situation, let's use it to build back better. And the other part of the Niger story that I didn't share is the initial kickstart, the foot up, if you like, came during famine. There was a lot of misinformation, lack of understanding on the role of trees. People saw trees as competitors with their crops. And we needed to tread carefully, work gently with people's beliefs, but edge them on to show, just try it. And now if I went to Niger with an axe, I would be lynched. People realize that they cannot live, they cannot sustain their families unless there are trees in their landscape. So by all means, address the immediate need, but seize the day, seize the opportunity to introduce necessary changes to the way we manage land and vegetation to build back a better future that's more resilient, more productive, and much, much less likely to plunge back into famine again.
Sometimes it's about getting from scarcity to just enough, but this actually could give us the opportunity not just to just enough, but to move to abundance. And that's an incredible vision, Tony.
Any community can do these things. So it's not going to involve them in dependency, in this inferiority complex whereby all good things must come from the West. So it's very liberating. I love it.
What message would you have for Canadians or Australians or people who are watching this to encourage them to care about these issues and to maybe consider taking action?
There's so much that we can do. And I'm sad, I speak in many venues around the world. And I see particularly young people, but perhaps older ones as well, who've lost hope. Oh, it's all too hard. Oh, it's so complex and it's too late. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's so much that we can do, and there's so much that we should do.
I like conserving trees because I'm an environment champion.
If we can keep the world green and keep healing the world, then maybe climate change will be something of the past.
Right. So that was Tony Ronaldo And I must admit, I found what he had to say very moving and very inspiring. So that really brings me to the end of what I had prepared. Anyone want to make any kind of reactions to any of the things that you saw there?
Kind of a question I had, I suppose, is, you know, it's great to see we've got World Vision there taking action, and I agree, it was an incredibly inspiring video. What about the governments within the different African countries? And I know there's a huge range probably of different responses, but is there a sense that they are taking climate change seriously?
I don't feel qualified to answer that.
Okay.
I mean, I've been digging in very much to two kind of major IPCC reports. They've got three reports, actually, or three major reports if you don't include the kind of executive summary kind of things. And the first one is about the science, the second one is about the impacts, and the third one is more about the kind of strategies for change. So the first one is 1,500 pages long. The second one is 1,800 pages long. I'm not sure how long the third one is. I've been dipping in quite a lot to those first two. I've got a feeling that some of the answers to your question might be in the third one.
Okay.
But the plan in this course is that we have one more study on a situation which I mentioned. We're going to look at the Mekong Delta, and then we'll have 4 on strategies for addressing these things. So I think maybe it'll come up in that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shirley, if I suggest you might start around about page 823 on the 3rd volume, you might be getting warm. I can speak a little bit about governance, which is the issue that Shirley's raising in Egypt, so North African country. And there's no question that the senior levels of government are absolutely aware of the threat of climate change. They're absolutely not climate change deniers. They recognize this is important. However, they are also struggling with numerous more short-term challenges to the country and to their own power. And to be brutally honest, they regard those as more existential threats than the fact that 30 years from now, the Mediterranean is going to rise and flood Alexandria. And of course, they're not alone as a group of politicians in preferring short-term over long-term solutions, because they see their own political careers in those terms. What this tends to mean is that if you read the official rhetoric, it will be very much saying the things you'd expect them to say. Climate change is a real threat. Egypt is in the line of fire. We're going to be faced with great problems. But if you know that the last time I looked, the Ministry of the Environment, I think, had something like 3 inspectors for all the industrial plants in the country. That is the reality, that they don't regard it as an immediate and pressing issue which would demand real resources and great political will.
Thank you, Jay.
If you're able to access the climate change, Adi Pitton on Sunday evenings. Last Sunday evening he was in Bhutan. I know it's not Africa, but that was very interesting about their attitude towards the environment as well.
Do you want to add a little bit more to that, Mark?
They put the importance of the environment and people's welfare and happiness above the economy or economic gains.
That's good.
I mean, I'm only going from what I saw on a television program. I can't speak with any authority on this, and they are actually carbon negative as a result of going down that route.
Good.
Poor, very poor, and behind the times in terms of other more developed countries, but generally, they reckon, more happy and contented, as well as being carbon negative.
Great example.
Bhutan is a fascinating outlier, isn't it? They were perhaps the first country in the world to form a ministry of happiness, and they are publicly committed that their number one priority as a country is to promote happiness.
But we are talking about a country with, I think, only a 750,000 population, so you know, there's perhaps a bit easier in that context, but
Interesting. Right. Any other comments, thoughts?
I just love the philosophy underlying what Tony was saying in that video about working with what you've got, and starting there and going from there. But it's just just incredible to see the change.
Right. Well, we're going to hand over to Mark now to tell us about either what he is doing or what he'd like to do or something along those lines. So, Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I suppose I've got a dual interest in a sense in this because, you know, personal interest, but also as a minister myself, a Baptist minister up in Essex, what's my responsibility towards, you know, the fellowship here as well. And I have to confess, up until recently, I've given very little thought or shown very little interest in the subject. And when I saw Simon's course advertised, I thought, I suppose I'd better sign up for it and start to educate myself. But it really has started me off on a journey, which I'm quite excited about, I have to say. I've got a 16-year-old daughter, my youngest daughter, who's much more knowledgeable, I think, and passionate about these things, and is teaching me a few lessons about it as well. And I'm thinking that way in relation to the church, whether that age group are the ones that, you know, can take the lead in taking these things seriously. So through your course, Simon, and other reading that I've started doing, you've given a very good biblical basis for what we're looking at. Dave Gregory's presentation was really the first time that I've really understood what we're talking about and the greenhouse effect and so on. And then it's caused me to do some wider reading. I've got a couple of books here that I've been ploughing my way through as well. And I've accumulated quite a lot of resources that I've seen and spotted that I'm hoping to get through. I found that Adi Pitten's series has been very, very interesting. It's only two programs so far, I think. I found that quite fascinating, very interesting.
What series is this you're talking about?
It's called Climate Change. I think it's 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening on BBC Two.
Right, yeah.
Both of the previous ones are on iPlayer. He's travelling to different places and looking at the effects of climate change in these different places. Very illuminating and very challenging. So I'm now not only getting very much into it and thinking about, you know, what we do in our family circumstances, our personal lives, but also how do I take this forward in the church? So I'm thinking of talking to the teens about it, saying is there a role that they'd like to take on here? Thinking about taking it up in a preaching series, perhaps in the autumn, and getting people to start thinking along these lines. So I'm grateful. That's as far as I've got so far. I'm grateful for sparking the interest and giving me the incentive to start getting my head around it.
Well, I'm incredibly encouraged by what you say there. So thank you so much. Just glad that it's you're finding it helpful. Right then. Well, we are just 1 minute past 8, which is not bad. Shirley's happy. Look at that.
Thank you, Simon, for tonight. That was a lot of work.
Yeah, well, it's good for me. And I mean, we've got 5 more lessons to go, but at some point, I mean, I'll just sort of pop this thought into your heads that I'd be very interested to have a discussion with us collectively or at any point to get your ideas about how we could, or I could, or we could make use of this course. in the future? You know, what would be the best way to develop it? Because I certainly didn't put all this work into it with the thought that that would be the end of the story. Wanting it to be kind of in some way used again. Anyway, so that's something you can sort of mull over, and at some point we can have a chat about it. All right, so I'm going to say a short prayer, and then we can go our separate ways. Lord Jesus, we thank you for things that we've been able to look at this evening, and in many ways they're very sobering thoughts, and I personally think that there's a lot that is said about climate change, but which misses some of the kind of gravity of the situation for people in Africa, people in the other parts of the world, whose livelihoods depend on the climate working as it should, of them being able to get food to eat. And so I pray, Lord, that you will help us, not just us here, but us as a nation, us all around the world, to just realize at the most basic level how climate change is going to impact people. And I can't see any way to avoid coming to the conclusion that it's going to lead to famines and deaths unless something dramatic changes. We do thank you, Lord, also for that, the thing that Tony Ronaldo had to share and say, and for his positivity and saying, you know, there's lots that we can do, and do pray that you will help us and others to not sort of throw our arms in the air and just imagine that it's all a lost battle, but to keep on doing what we can see to do. So we pray all these things in your name, Lord. Amen.
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 Simon, just thinking that Adi Adipitton program last Sunday again, he did give a passing mention to Vietnam.
Okay.
And the future prospects for them as well.
All right, maybe I need to catch it, so I've prepared for that.
It's very brief, so it's a whole hour you've got to watch to catch it probably.
Right, okay. Yeah. Just before we all go our separate ways, so Colin, you're going to do our little slot in 2 weeks' time, is that right?
Yep,
Yeah.
fine, yeah.
Would anyone like to volunteer to do it the following lesson?
Can I volunteer someone in my family to do a slot?
Absolutely, you can. Yeah.
Because my sister works for an organisation, government, well, a charity that's campaigning for aviation awareness of environmental needs in aviation. And if I asked her to come and share just for a few minutes about what she does, I'm sure she'd love to do that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, she wouldn't have to go anywhere. She could just log on, couldn't she?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. No, that'd be great. So, so Shirley, that will be for the 20th of May. All right.
Okay. Yeah, I'll check that she's free to do it, but I'm sure she'd love to give some input.
Excellent. Okay. Good job. All right. I should say goodbye to everyone.
Okay.
Thank you, Simon. Bye, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.